Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of blaring sirens. The radio warns of incoming missiles. In schools, teachers hurriedly lead students into the basement, teaching them to crouch under tiny wooden desks as if that could protect them from a nuclear blast. Many families quietly build shelters right in their backyards, stockpiling canned goods and drinking water, preparing for a doomsday that could strike at any moment, but fortunately never came. That was life in America during the Cold War, a war never officially declared, yet haunting every household, every classroom, and every decision in the White House. Unlike wars fought with guns and bombs on the battlefield, this was a war in the shadows, where secrets, propaganda, and fear spread everywhere. It was a contest not only to see who possessed the bigger bomb, but also to determine which ideology would shape the future of humanity. From the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world stood on the brink of destruction for 13 days, to the race for space exploration, to the proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, the Cold War was present everywhere, shaping America into the superpower we know today. But the big question remains: how did this confrontation begin, and how close did the United States and the Soviet Union come to destroying each other as well as the entire world?
In 1945, the guns of World War II had just fallen silent, and the world seemed to be stepping into an era of peace. But in reality, it was the beginning of a tense confrontation that lasted nearly half a century, the Cold War. To understand why the United States and the Soviet Union became two uncompromising rivals, we need to look back at the historical context right after the war ended. The world after 1945, victory and devastation. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, and Japan accepted surrender after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of the same year, the world entered a turbulent post-war period. Tens of millions had died, and many cities in Europe and Asia were nothing but rubble. In this setting, only 2 great powers stood out from the ruins: the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States not only possessed the world's largest economy, accounting for nearly half of global industrial output, but was also the only country at that time holding nuclear weapons. In the eyes of many, America was a beacon of freedom, democracy, and prosperity. In contrast, the Soviet Union emerged from the war with devastating losses. More than 20 million dead, cities destroyed, and an exhausted economy. But the Soviet Union had one key difference: a massive army with millions of soldiers occupying all of Eastern Europe, along with the prestige of being the nation that played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. From this difference, the seeds of confrontation were sown. The United States believed that the post-war world order should be based on democracy, free markets, and international cooperation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, sought to expand communism and build its own sphere of influence to ensure security. The Iron Curtain descends. Immediately after the war ended, the Soviet Union quickly consolidated power in Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all gradually fell into the hands of pro-Soviet governments. Stalin considered this a necessary buffer zone to protect the Soviet Union from future Western invasions. However, to the United States and Western Europe, these moves were seen as dangerous communist expansion. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in a famous speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, warned, "An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." The phrase Iron Curtain, from then on, became the symbol of division between East and West, between the communist world and the free world. The conferences and the collapse of trust. In fact, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Roosevelt, Churchill, later Attlee, and Stalin sat together to discuss the new world order. They agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones and to establish the United Nations to maintain peace. But suspicion soon overshadowed cooperation. The Americans accused the Soviets of failing to honor their promise of free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin believed the West was trying to isolate and encircle the Soviet Union. Both sides looked at each other with distrust, each step preparing for a long confrontation. The Red Scare in America. Inside the United States, after the war, fears of communism began to spread. Many politicians and journalists warned that the Soviet Union would not stop in Europe, but would also try to spread communist ideology across the globe, even within America itself. The American people, having just endured a world war, now lived in anxiety about a new and equally frightening enemy. This fear was not just in newspapers or speeches, but became part of everyday life. Hollywood movies began portraying the communist spy as an ever-present threat. In politics, calls to be tough on Moscow echoed everywhere. The containment doctrine, a shift in U.S. policy. A major turning point came in 1947, when President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. For the first time, the United States officially declared it would aid any nation threatened by communism. Greece and Turkey were two key examples. With U.S. financial and military support, both countries managed to avoid falling into communist hands. This marked a fundamental change in American foreign policy. Before the war, the U.S. often followed isolationism, limiting involvement in global affairs. But from this point, America became the leader of the free world, ready to intervene anywhere to contain the red tide. The Marshall Plan, an economic weapon. That same year, another strategic move was introduced, the Marshall Plan. This was a massive aid program worth billions of dollars to rebuild Europe's economy after the war. For the U.S., it was not only humanitarian, but also a political tool. A prosperous Europe would be less vulnerable to communist appeal. In reality, the Marshall Plan was a resounding success. Western European economies recovered rapidly, and trust in America grew strongly. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc nations refused to participate, viewing it as a scheme of manipulation. As a result, the East-West divide became increasingly clear. The birth of NATO and a divided world. The climax of division came in 1949 when the United States and Western allies founded NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was an unprecedented military alliance, pledging that an attack on any member would be treated as an attack on all. This meant the U.S. had officially assumed the role of security protector for all of Western Europe. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, forming two opposing military blocs. From then on, the world entered a sharply polarized era where every nation had to choose a side. The atomic bomb and nuclear fear. Another factor that made the post-World War II context uniquely dangerous was the arrival of nuclear weapons. In 1945, the U.S. became the only nation with the atomic bomb and demonstrated its terrifying power in Japan. But only 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear bomb. This ended the American nuclear monopoly and opened a new era, the arms race. Americans began living with the fear that at any moment nuclear war could break out. Schools held duck-and-cover drills, children hiding under desks at the sound of sirens. Many families built fallout shelters in their own backyards. End of Chapter 1. A World Divided. By the late 1940s, the global picture was clear. On one side stood the United States, leading the capitalist democracies with economic power, nuclear weapons, and a vast network of allies. On the other stood the Soviet Union, champion of communism, controlling Eastern Europe with immense military might. Between these two superpowers lay the entire world, split by the Iron Curtain. The confrontation had not yet erupted into direct war, but the tension, suspicion, and shows of power all foreshadowed a dangerous new chapter in history, the Cold War. For the United States, this was not just a security challenge, but the greatest test of its identity, its values, and its role as a global leader. Americans entered this era with both confidence and fear, and above all, with the awareness that they were facing an uncompromising enemy.
When World War II ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities had been bombed into rubble, industries destroyed, and millions of people displaced. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Nazi Germany, suddenly faced each other as the two dominant powers on the continent. The fragile peace quickly gave way to suspicion, and Europe became the first major battleground of the Cold War. The earliest crises, particularly in Berlin, revealed just how deep the mistrust ran and how quickly cooperation could collapse into confrontation. Germany was at the center of this struggle. After the defeat of Hitler, the country had been divided into 4 zones of occupation, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary until a peace treaty could be signed. But as relations between East and West deteriorated, Germany became the symbolic and physical front line of the Cold War. The first crisis erupted in 1948 when the Western Allies announced plans to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their zones of Germany. They saw this as a necessary step to stabilize the economy and help Europe recover through the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union, however, viewed it as a threat. They feared that a strong capitalist West Germany would undermine their control of Eastern Europe. In response, Stalin ordered the blockade of West Berlin, cutting off all rail, road, and canal access from the western zones to the city. The blockade of Berlin was one of the boldest moves of the early Cold War. 2 million people in West Berlin suddenly found themselves cut off from food, fuel, and supplies. Stalin hoped the Western Allies would abandon the city, leaving it under Soviet control. Instead, the United States and its allies launched an unprecedented operation, the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, from June 1948 to May 1949, American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering food, coal, and medicine to the people of West Berlin. At the height of the operation, planes landed every few minutes, keeping the city alive despite the blockade. The success of the Berlin Airlift was a powerful demonstration of Western resolve. It showed that the United States was willing to defend its allies and resist Soviet pressure without triggering a full-scale war. For the people of West Berlin, it was a symbol of hope and solidarity. For the Soviet Union, the failure of the blockade was a humiliation. In May 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade, but the damage was done. Germany was now firmly divided, with the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, established in the West, and the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, created in the Soviet zone. The Berlin crisis had lasting consequences. It hardened the division of Europe into 2 blocks. The Western nations, fearing further Soviet aggression, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. This military alliance bound the United States, Canada, and most Western European nations together in a pledge to defend one another against attack. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 by creating the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of Eastern European communist states under Moscow's control. The division of Germany had become permanent, and Berlin would remain a flashpoint of the Cold War for decades. While Europe was the primary stage of the early Cold War, the confrontation soon spread to other parts of the world. The first major test outside Europe came in Asia, with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. After Japan's defeat in World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet Union supporting a communist government in the north, and the United States backing a non-communist government in the south. In June 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and weapons, invaded South Korea in a bid to unify the peninsula under communism. The invasion shocked the United States and its allies. President Harry Truman quickly committed American forces to defend South Korea under the banner of the United Nations. The Korean War became the first hot war of the Cold War, a brutal conflict in which superpower rivalry played out through local armies. At first, the North Koreans advanced rapidly, capturing Seoul and pushing deep into the south. But a daring amphibious landing at Incheon by General Douglas MacArthur turned the tide. United Nations forces pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel and advanced toward the Chinese border. China, fearing an American invasion, entered the war on the side of North Korea. Waves of Chinese troops poured into the peninsula, driving UN forces back into the south. The war settled into a bloody stalemate, with battles fought back and forth near the original dividing line. After 3 years of fighting and millions of casualties, an armistice was signed in 1953, restoring the division of Korea at the 38th parallel. The Korean War left the peninsula divided, with no peace treaty ever signed, and the legacy of that conflict still shapes the region today. The Korean War had global implications. It convinced the United States that communism was an aggressive force that had to be contained everywhere. American defense spending soared, and military bases spread across the world. NATO was strengthened, and new alliances were formed in Asia, including the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, deepened its ties with China and expanded its influence in the developing world. The Cold War had become a truly global conflict. Back in Europe, Berlin continued to be a source of tension. In 1953, East German workers launched a protest against poor living conditions and lack of freedom. The uprising spread across East Berlin and other cities, but Soviet tanks crushed the rebellion. This event highlighted the repressive nature of communist regimes and the determination of the Soviet Union to maintain control over its satellite states. It also showed the limits of American influence, as the West could do little to help those behind the Iron Curtain. Throughout the 1950s, crises continued to erupt. In 1956, Hungary attempted to break free from Soviet control. Inspired by hopes of greater freedom, Hungarians demanded reforms and even withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. For a brief moment, it seemed possible, but Soviet troops invaded Budapest, brutally suppressing the rebellion and killing thousands. Once again, the West expressed outrage but did not intervene militarily, fearing escalation into a world war. For people living in Eastern Europe, these events were a harsh reminder that Moscow's grip was unyielding. At the same time, the Cold War spread into the Middle East. In 1956, the Suez Crisis erupted when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, previously controlled by Britain and France. Israel, Britain, and France launched a military intervention, but the United States and the Soviet Union both opposed their actions. In a rare moment of cooperation, Washington and Moscow pressured the attackers to withdraw. The crisis signaled a shift in global power, showing that old European empires were no longer dominant and that the United States and Soviet Union now held the decisive influence. By the end of the 1950s, the Cold War had become a contest fought on multiple fronts: Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and increasingly Africa and Latin America. The ideological confrontation was no longer confined to speeches and propaganda. It had become a struggle involving wars, revolutions, alliances, and crises that touched every corner of the globe. At the heart of it all, Berlin remained the most visible symbol of division,
a city that embodied the conflict between two worlds. The early Cold War crises were crucial in shaping the nature of the conflict. They revealed that neither side was willing to back down easily. They also showed that the Cold War would not be a direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, but rather a series of indirect confrontations fought through allies, proxies, and local conflicts. Each crisis deepened the mistrust and made compromise harder. Each conflict reinforced the idea that the struggle was not temporary, but long-term, perhaps even permanent. As the world entered the 1960s, the stakes grew even higher. Nuclear weapons, once a terrifying novelty, now became central to the balance of power. Space exploration, technological rivalry, and espionage added new dimensions to the struggle. The Cold War had already shaken Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, but even greater crises were on the horizon. From Cuba to Vietnam, from Berlin to outer space, the confrontation between the superpowers was only beginning to intensify.
Many people often immediately think of the tense confrontations between Washington and Moscow, of nuclear missiles, spies, and proxy wars in distant countries. However, an equally important part of this historical period took place right in the daily lives of millions of Americans. Fear, faith, confusion, and even optimism were clearly reflected through various aspects of social life, from schools, culture, and media to family meals. This chapter will delve into how the Cold War was not only a battle of wits between two superpowers, but also became a part of everyday life in America. As early as the late 1940s, when tensions with the Soviet Union increased, the U.S. government began implementing widespread propaganda programs to prepare citizens to cope with the threat of nuclear war. One of the most famous symbols was the animated film Duck and Cover, shown in schools across the United States. In it, Bert the Turtle taught children how to duck down and cover their heads when a nuclear explosion occurred. Today, this image may seem naive, but at the time, it was clear evidence that nuclear fear had penetrated even the childhoods of American children. Not only limited to schools, American families were also encouraged to build nuclear shelters in their backyards or basements. Advertisements in newspapers, magazines, and television regularly introduced family shelter models, along with instructions on stockpiling food, water, flashlights, and medicine enough for several weeks. Building shelters became a trend, even a symbol of caution and responsibility toward the family. Although in reality, shelters could hardly provide complete protection against the devastating power of nuclear bombs, they gave many people a sense of security and the belief that they could survive if disaster struck. The fear of nuclear war also permeated popular culture. Hollywood films of the 1950s and 1960s often reflected this threat in various ways. Some science fiction films depicted giant monsters appearing after nuclear tests, such as Godzilla in Japan, or Them in the United States with mutant giant ants. There were also more serious and direct films, such as the 1959 movie On the Beach, which portrayed a post-nuclear war world where survivors awaited death from radiation. By 1964, Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, used satirical humor to depict the madness of the arms race. Cinema, in one way or another, reflected the fear while also helping Americans confront it. Music was also a channel to express the emotions of this era. Many songs reflected the fear of nuclear war, while others carried uplifting messages, affirming the strength and unity of Americans in the face of danger. On the radio, political speeches mixed with warning broadcasts, keeping people constantly in a state of tension. Another important aspect of the Cold War in American life was the spread of fear of communism. From the late 1940s, when the Soviet Union succeeded in developing the atomic bomb, and especially after China fell to communism in 1949, the anti-communist movement in America exploded strongly. The Red Scare became a part of political and social life. Investigative committees, most notably the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held public hearings to investigate those suspected of communist ties. Hollywood was among the most heavily affected. Many actors, screenwriters, and directors were blacklisted simply for being suspected of communist sympathies. Their careers ended, and even their personal lives were destroyed. Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, became a symbolic figure of this period when he launched a series of extreme anti-communist campaigns, even slandering many people without clear evidence. Although McCarthy later lost credibility, the McCarthyism movement left a deep mark on American society, spreading fear and mutual suspicion. Within families, the fear of communism also penetrated. Many parents encouraged their children to remain absolutely loyal to America, to be wary of strange and foreign ideas. In schools, students were taught not only math, literature, and science, but also political awareness, that they were part of a global ideological struggle. Textbooks, propaganda posters, and billboards all contributed to affirming America's image as the beacon of freedom, in contrast to the darkness of dictatorship under communism. The Cold War also affected the American economy in very particular ways. The defense industry developed strongly, creating millions of jobs. Weapons, aircraft, and high-tech manufacturing areas sprang up everywhere, helping push the U.S. economy into becoming a superpower. But as they grew, many people also realized that their prosperity was tied to a dangerous arms race. That mix of pride and worry became a characteristic feature of American social psychology for decades. Another interesting detail was how Americans adopted and transformed military technology into civilian life. Many inventions during the Cold War, such as computers, satellites, and rockets, were initially for the military, but gradually became part of everyday life. From this technological race, America achieved major advances in many scientific fields, ultimately sending humans to the moon in 1969. The Apollo 11 mission was not only a victory over the Soviet Union in the space race, but also a source of national pride, making millions of Americans feel that their efforts and sacrifices during the Cold War were worthwhile. However, one cannot overlook the negative impacts that the Cold War brought to the mental life of Americans. Millions lived in constant anxiety, knowing that at any moment nuclear war could break out and everything would end in an instant. Nightmares of doomsday haunted many generations, from children to adults. Numerous works of literature, cinema, and art were created to reflect this obsession, while also questioning the true value of life in the shadow of weapons of mass destruction. The Cold War, after all, was not just a series of political and military events, but also a unique socio-cultural period. It left its mark in every classroom, in every film, in every newspaper, and in every American family. It shaped habits, lifestyles, beliefs, and even the fears of tens of millions of Americans. Looking back, it becomes clear that global tensions not only played out in diplomatic conferences or distant battlefields, but also permeated the daily moments of Americans for nearly half a century.
The 60s began. The Cold War had already shown itself to be unlike any conflict in human history. It was not merely a competition of armies or ideologies, but a relentless race for dominance in two of the most terrifying and awe-inspiring fields of modern science: nuclear weapons and space exploration. These two competitions, though seemingly different, were deeply connected. Both reflected the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union to prove not only their military superiority, but also the superiority of their political systems.
The arms race threatened to destroy humanity, while the space race captured imaginations worldwide. Together, they defined the very essence of the Cold War era. The nuclear arms race began in earnest at the end of the Second World War. In August 1945, the United States had shocked the world by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender and demonstrating a new level of destructive power. For a brief period, America held a monopoly on nuclear weapons. But that monopoly was short-lived. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, shattering the American sense of invulnerability. From that moment forward, both superpowers were locked in a relentless struggle to develop more powerful and more numerous weapons. The logic of deterrence quickly took hold. Neither side wanted to use nuclear weapons first, knowing that retaliation would bring unimaginable destruction. Yet both were determined to have enough weapons to ensure that, if attacked, they could respond with devastating force. This doctrine became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was a grim concept. Peace would be preserved not through cooperation, but through the terrifying certainty that war would mean annihilation for both sides. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union poured vast resources into building arsenals of nuclear bombs and delivery systems. At first, these were massive bomber aircraft capable of flying long distances and dropping atomic bombs on enemy cities. But soon, technology advanced. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, meant that nuclear weapons could be delivered across the globe in minutes. Submarines equipped with nuclear missiles added another layer of danger, able to strike from hidden positions under the sea. By the 1960s, the world lived under the constant shadow of a nuclear exchange that could wipe out civilization. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 demonstrated just how close the world could come to destruction. When the Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast, the United States responded with a naval blockade and demanded their removal. For 13 tense days, the world watched as President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev maneuvered dangerously close to nuclear war. In the end, the Soviets agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and the quiet removal of American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without a war, but it left an indelible impression on both sides. The nuclear arms race could easily spiral out of control. In response to these dangers, efforts were made to establish some limits. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, forcing them underground. It was a modest step, but it reflected a recognition that unrestrained competition could poison the planet and increase the risks of war. Later agreements, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, sought to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries. Yet the arms race continued, with both superpowers producing thousands of warheads, enough to destroy the world many times over. Parallel to this terrifying buildup of nuclear arms was the space race, a competition that, while less deadly, was no less intense. Space exploration became another front in the Cold War, a dramatic stage on which the United States and the Soviet Union sought to demonstrate their scientific and technological prowess. The space race captured the imagination of billions and symbolized the larger struggle between communism and democracy. The Soviet Union struck the first blow in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The tiny beeping sphere shocked the United States, proving that the Soviets had not only mastered rocket technology, but also had the capability to deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The American public was stunned, and politicians declared that the United States had fallen behind. Schools were urged to improve science education, and the government poured money into research and development. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was created in 1958 to coordinate America's space program. The Soviet Union continued to notch impressive victories. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, a triumph that electrified the world and demonstrated Soviet leadership in space. The United States scrambled to catch up, launching Alan Shepard and later John Glenn into space, but it was clear that the Soviets were ahead in the early years. Each Soviet success was hailed as proof of communism's superiority, while each American setback was portrayed as evidence of democracy's weakness. President John F. Kennedy recognized that the United States needed a bold challenge to rally the nation. In 1961, he stood before Congress and declared that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was an audacious goal, one that required enormous investment, technological innovation, and determination. But it galvanized the American public and set the stage for one of the greatest achievements in human history. The Apollo program became the centerpiece of America's space race effort. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and astronauts worked tirelessly to develop the spacecraft, rockets, and systems needed to achieve the lunar goal. Along the way, there were triumphs and tragedies. The Apollo 1 mission ended in disaster in 1967 when a fire during a ground test killed 3 astronauts. The accident was a sobering reminder of the risks involved, but it did not stop the program. Step by step, the missions advanced, testing spacecraft in Earth orbit, then around the Moon, and finally, in 1969, attempting the ultimate goal. On July 20, 1969, the world watched in awe as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the Moon during the Apollo 11 mission. Armstrong's words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across the globe. The United States had achieved Kennedy's vision and overtaken the Soviet Union in the space race. It was a moment of immense pride for America and a symbolic victory in the Cold War. For the Soviets, who had achieved so much in the early years, it was a bitter defeat. The space race did not end with Apollo 11, but the moon landing marked its peak. In the years that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union continued to explore space, launching space stations, probes, and other missions. Yet the urgency and intensity of the competition gradually diminished. The costs of space exploration were enormous, and both nations began to seek cooperation as well as competition. The Apollo-Soyuz test project of 1975, in which American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, symbolized a new era of détente and the possibility of collaboration even amid rivalry. Despite moments of cooperation, the nuclear arms race remained a constant source of tension. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, both superpowers continued to build more sophisticated weapons, including multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, which allowed a single missile to carry several warheads aimed at different targets. Efforts at arms control, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, produced agreements that capped the number of certain weapons, but they did not fundamentally end the competition. The doctrine of deterrence and the fear of falling behind ensured that the race continued. The impact of the arms and space races on American society was profound. Billions of dollars were spent on defense and space programs, fueling technological innovation, but also raising questions about priorities. In schools, students practiced duck and cover drills, learning how to hide under desks in case of nuclear attack, even though such measures would have offered little real protection. Popular culture reflected the anxieties of the time, with films, books, and television shows imagining nuclear apocalypse or space adventure. The Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle, it was part of daily life, shaping how people thought about the future
Of the Cold War, one of the most remarkable confrontations did not take place on land or sea, but in the skies and outer space. This was not only a competition of science and technology, but also a symbolic battle over national prestige, ideology, and the power of the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. People called it the space race, a dramatic chapter that shone with the light of knowledge while being overshadowed by the terrifying fear of nuclear war. This race began in the late 1950s, when the Soviet Union unexpectedly launched the Sputnik 1 satellite into Earth's orbit on October 4, 1957. Just a small metal sphere emitting a simple beep-beep on radio waves, but it shocked the entire world. Americans could not believe that their rival had surpassed them in space science. The Sputnik event alarmed the American public, as many feared that if the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, they could also fire nuclear missiles from space onto American soil at any time. The U.S. government immediately reacted. President Dwight Eisenhower ordered the establishment of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958, in order to focus all resources on research and space conquest. At the same time, the U.S. Congress passed many new education programs emphasizing mathematics, science, and engineering to train a new generation capable of facing the Soviet challenge. This was the period when millions of American students began studying more physics, chemistry, and rocket technology, with the belief that knowledge would be the key weapon in global competition. The Soviet Union continued to shock the world when it launched Sputnik 2 just a month later, carrying the dog Laika, the first living creature to orbit Earth. This event sparked much debate in the U.S. Some admired Soviet scientific ability, but many others worried that America was gradually falling behind. The competition was no longer simply about science, but about the struggle between two political systems, capitalist democracy and totalitarian communism. By 1961, the Soviet Union once again took the lead with the flight of Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut to enter space and complete an orbit around Earth. While the world admired the Soviet achievement, in the U.S., the event was seen as a wake-up call. President John F. Kennedy, just a few months after taking office, made a historic decision. In his speech before Congress in May 1961, he declared the goal of landing an American on the moon before the end of the decade. This was a bold declaration, affirming that the United States would not accept being second in any field, especially space. Kennedy's declaration ignited a fire in America. NASA received massive funding, and tens of thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers were recruited to work on space programs. The Mercury program, followed by Gemini, and finally Apollo, were created step by step toward the moon goal. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to push its own space projects, from sending the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space to conducting long-duration flights to prove survival beyond orbit. This race was not just about science, it was also propaganda. Every time an American astronaut launched successfully, U.S. media praised it as proof of the superiority of democracy. Conversely, every Soviet achievement was used to demonstrate the strength of communism. Citizens of both countries closely followed every news story, every picture, every moment of the space missions. For many American families, turning on the television to watch news about space flights became an exciting habit. However, the space race was not always smooth. In January 1967, tragedy struck the Apollo 1 program when a fire broke out in the cockpit during a ground test, killing 3 American astronauts. The accident shocked the entire nation, raising questions about whether conquering the moon was worth the cost. But from that tragedy, NASA drew important lessons, improved safety systems, and pressed forward. finally, on July 20th, 1969, the historic moment arrived. Apollo 11 landed on the moon's surface, and astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped down, leaving the first human footprint beyond Earth. The famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed across global media. Hundreds of millions of people around the world watched the event live on television. For America, this was not just a scientific triumph, but also a political and ideological victory. The U.S. had proven it could lead, achieving a goal once thought impossible. For the Soviet Union, Apollo 11 was a bitter defeat. Although they continued their space program afterward and achieved many successes, such as the Salyut and Mir space stations, in the eyes of the international public, America's moon victory was decisive. The space race gradually shifted from fierce rivalry to long-term research competition and eventually to cooperation, as in the Apollo-Soyuz project in 1975. The space race left many legacies for humanity. Scientific and technological advances from the U.S. and Soviet space programs were widely applied in daily life. From computer technology, navigation systems, and new materials, to innovations in medicine and communications, all originated from the demanding requirements of space conquest. Space became a symbol of knowledge, of hope, and a reminder that even in the tensest times, humanity could still achieve great progress. But it cannot be denied that behind the glory of space flights was the shadow of war. The rockets that carried people into space were developed from ballistic missile technology, originally designed to deliver nuclear warheads. That is why every step forward in space was accompanied by fears of weapons escalation. Americans, while proud to see their flag on the moon, still understood that the space race was only one part of the larger Cold War picture, where humanity's survival was always overshadowed by the threat of nuclear destruction. The space race was clear evidence of how the Cold War permeated every field of life and science. It turned the sky into a battlefield, astronauts into silent warriors, and science into a tool for national power. But above all, it left a priceless lesson, that even in the fiercest confrontations, humanity could still reach for the stars and leave footprints on another world.
And the space race unfolded openly, broadcast live and attracting the attention of millions of people around the world. Another front quietly existed in the shadows. This was the front of spies, of secret agents, of silent but tense battles of wits. If the military battlefield had bombs and bullets, the political battlefield had speeches and conferences. Then the espionage battlefield had codes, top-secret documents, double briefcases, and people living double lives. It was in this world that the Cold War most clearly showed the complexity, suspicion, and danger the two superpowers faced. Right after World War II, when the Soviet Union and the United States began shifting from allies to rivals, intelligence agencies quickly became crucial tools. In the U.S., the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was established in 1947, tasked not only with gathering information, but also with conducting covert operations to prevent the spread of communism. On the Soviet side was the Committee for State Security, or KGB, an agency that both gathered intelligence abroad and maintained control at home, ensuring absolute loyalty to the Communist Party. These two agencies quickly became direct opponents, with battles of wits spreading from New York, Washington, to Moscow, Berlin, and many other capitals around the world. One of the hot spots of the espionage war was Berlin, a city divided into East and West. Here, spies from both sides operated densely, trying to recruit discontented people, collect military information, or find escape routes across the Berlin Wall. There were stories like those out of novels, with secret tunnels dug across the border, cars modified to hide people in the engine compartment, or spies exchanging documents in parks at night. Berlin became the espionage capital of the world, where every street corner could be the scene of an operation. Throughout the Cold War, both sides experienced successes and failures in intelligence. The U.S. was once shocked to discover the Soviet nuclear program advancing faster than expected, largely due to the Soviets successfully planting many spies in America's and Britain's top-secret projects. One of the most famous cases was the Rosenberg trial in the U.S., when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were sentenced to death for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. The case shocked, but it also reflected America's extreme fear of betrayal from within. On the other hand, the CIA also carried out daring operations. One of them was the use of U-2 spy planes to photograph Soviet territory from extreme altitudes. These flights allowed the U.S. to grasp the state of the Soviet nuclear and military arsenal, providing important information for policymakers. However, in 1960, a U-2 flown by pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down by the Soviet Union, forcing President Eisenhower to face a serious diplomatic scandal. This event showed that even the most sophisticated technology could not guarantee absolute safety in the world of espionage. Beyond technological and military espionage, the spy war also raged strongly in the ideological field. The CIA often funded newspapers, art organizations, even literary prizes to promote democratic and free values. Conversely, the Soviet Union used the KGB to push propaganda, planting agents in anti-war or civil rights movements in America to sow division. It could be said that the espionage war was not only about controlling information, but also about controlling human thought and belief. Another important aspect of this front was defections. Many spies, scientists, or high-ranking officials from both sides chose to leave their homelands in search of freedom or safety. Each defection was a shock, giving the receiving side valuable information while shaking confidence on the losing side. Spies like Oleg Gordievsky, who once held a high position in the KGB but later collaborated with British intelligence, provided the West with a treasure trove of information about Soviet operations. Conversely, there were also cases like Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen, CIA and FBI employees who secretly worked for the Soviet Union for many years, causing incalculable damage to the U.S. Behind all these dramatic missions was an atmosphere of constant fear. Americans worried that communist spies lived right next door. Soviets were always under KGB surveillance, haunted by the fear of being accused of spying for the West. Suspicion seeped into every corner of society, turning people into both tools and victims at the same time. The spy war also spurred the development of surveillance, tracking, and encryption technologies. Tiny recording devices, cameras hidden in lighters, suitcases with radio equipment, all became symbols of this era. At the same time, cryptography developed explosively, as both sides sought to protect information and crack each other's codes. This laid the foundation for the later development of cybersecurity and information technology. It could be said that the espionage front was a mirror reflecting the true nature of the Cold War. It was not only a struggle between two superpowers, but also a struggle over trust, loyalty, and patience. Spies, often without carrying guns or bombs, held the fate of the entire world in their hands. A leaked document, a stolen secret, could shift the balance of global power. As the Cold War gradually came to an end in the late 1980s, many intelligence secrets were revealed. People learned the scale of espionage networks, the infiltration of the KGB into Western governments, as well as the enormous efforts of the CIA to break Soviet influence. These revelations left people both amazed and chilled, realizing that for more than 42 years, the whole world had lived in a grand play, where every truth could be hidden behind masks. The espionage war of the Cold War left a complex legacy. It contributed to mutual distrust among nations, but at the same time drove advances in science and technology. It produced extraordinary, dramatic stories that literature and cinema have never tired of exploring. And most importantly, it showed that even when guns fell silent, the silent battles in the shadows could still decide the fate of all humanity.
In the final act of the Cold War, the world witnessed dramatic events that would reshape the global order. The decades of political tension, ideological confrontation, and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed eternal. Yet, in less than a decade, the seemingly unshakable Soviet system crumbled, and the Cold War reached its conclusion. The climax of this extraordinary story is best captured by two defining events: the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the official dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. These moments symbolized not only the end of an era, but also the triumph of ideas that had been suppressed behind iron curtains for generations. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, was more than just a physical barrier. It represented the ideological divide between East and West, between communism and capitalism, between authoritarian control and democratic freedom. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as the most visible scar of the Cold War. Families were separated, lives were lost attempting to cross, and Berlin became the frontline city of global confrontation. But by the late 1980s, cracks were forming, both literally and metaphorically. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev faced enormous internal pressure. His policies of perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness, were intended to revitalize the Soviet system. Instead, they unleashed forces that Moscow could no longer control. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and the burden of maintaining control over Eastern Europe had drained the Soviet state. At the same time, in Eastern European nations like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, grassroots movements were rising, demanding greater freedom and reform. In East Germany, people were restless. The Stasi, one of the most feared secret police organizations in the world, had maintained a tight grip on society for decades. Yet by the late 1980s, protests were growing in Leipzig, Dresden, and other cities. The chants for freedom grew louder, and the East German government, under Erich Honecker, found itself unable to suppress the demand for change. When Hungary opened its border with Austria in 1989, thousands of East Germans fled westward, signaling that the Iron Curtain was no longer impenetrable. On November 9, 1989, a miscommunication during a press conference led East German officials to announce that citizens would be allowed to cross the border freely. That night, thousands of Berliners rushed to the checkpoints. Border guards, overwhelmed and uncertain, eventually opened the gates. The world watched live on television as ordinary men and women climbed atop the Berlin Wall, embraced relatives from the West, and hammered away at the concrete that had divided Europe for so long. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than the collapse of a barrier. It was the collapse of fear, the victory of human spirit, and the beginning of the end for the Soviet bloc. The images of East and West Germans celebrating together became some of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. For Americans, the fall of the wall was celebrated as a triumph of the values they had long championed: freedom, democracy, and the promise of opportunity. President George H.W. Bush responded cautiously at first, wary of destabilization, but soon recognized the historic nature of what was unfolding. In Moscow, however, the event was a devastating blow to Soviet prestige and authority. Following the fall of the wall, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed in rapid succession. Poland embraced democracy, Czechoslovakia experienced the Velvet Revolution, and even the once hardline Romania overthrew Nicolae Ceausescu in a violent uprising. The Soviet Union found itself increasingly isolated, unable to maintain the empire it had built through force and intimidation. Inside the USSR, the situation deteriorated further. Gorbachev's reforms had backfired. Instead of strengthening socialism, they fueled nationalism in the Soviet republics. In the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, independence movements grew unstoppable. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, ethnic conflicts flared, and calls for autonomy grew louder. The rigid system of Soviet control had been loosened, and now the pieces of the empire were breaking apart. The final years of the Cold War were marked by uncertainty. In August 1991, hardline communist leaders attempted a coup to remove Gorbachev and restore strict control. The coup ultimately failed, largely due to massive public protests and the defiance of Boris Yeltsin, who emerged as a symbol of democratic resistance. The failure of the coup accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. By December 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned as president, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. 15 independent nations emerged from the collapse, and the United States found itself as the sole global superpower. The end of the Cold War brought both celebration and challenges. For the people of Eastern Europe, it was a moment of liberation, the chance to pursue democracy and freedom after decades of oppression. For the United States, it marked a historic victory, but it also raised new questions about how to lead in a unipolar world. Without the Soviet Union as a rival, the balance of global politics shifted, and America's role as the dominant power became both an opportunity and a burden. The collapse of the Soviet Union also left behind enormous uncertainty. Economic chaos, political instability, and lingering nuclear weapons in newly independent states created new dangers. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, struggled with transition, corruption, and identity. While the Cold War had ended, the world was far from entering a period of perfect peace. Yet the symbolic power of the Berlin Wall's fall remains undeniable. It was not simply the destruction of a structure, but the dismantling of an entire system of fear and division. For nearly half a century, the Cold War had shaped the lives of millions, dictating alliances, wars, and ideologies. Its end was a testament to the resilience of human hope, the power of ideas, and the possibility of change even in the face of seemingly unshakable systems. As we look back today, the Cold War may seem like history, but its legacy continues to shape our present. The triumphs and mistakes of that era offer lessons for our own time. The fall of the Berlin Wall reminds us that no wall, however strong, can withstand the determination of people who yearn for freedom. The collapse of the Soviet Union reminds us that even the most powerful empires can crumble when they lose the trust of their people. The story of the Cold War ends not with nuclear war or global destruction, but with celebration in the streets of Berlin. It ends not with fire, but with the sound of hammers breaking concrete, of voices shouting for freedom, of people hugging across what was once an impassable divide. That is the legacy of the Cold War's conclusion, and that is the message it leaves to future generations.
Finally ended, the world entered a new chapter of history. For nearly half a century, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union had shaped international politics, defined national identities, and influenced every corner of the globe. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the bipolar world, but it did not erase the scars of decades of confrontation. The legacy of the Cold War remains with us, in political structures, in military alliances, in cultural memory, and in the shape of today's global order. One of the most enduring legacies of the Cold War is the existence of military alliances that were created during the standoff. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was born in 1949 as a defense pact against potential Soviet aggression. Although the Soviet Union no longer exists, NATO remains a powerful institution with dozens of member states and operations that extend beyond Europe. In response, The Warsaw Pact once symbolized the unity of communist nations, but it dissolved alongside the Soviet Empire. The survival of NATO and its expansion into Eastern Europe continues to shape relations between the West and modern Russia. Another lasting consequence lies in the global military balance. The nuclear arms race left behind massive arsenals of weapons of mass destruction. While the Cold War avoided direct nuclear conflict, the sheer scale of the buildup created a world in which humanity had the capacity to destroy itself many times over. Even after arms control treaties reduced stockpiles, thousands of nuclear weapons remain, a constant reminder of the Cold War's shadow. The doctrines of deterrence and mutually assured destruction still influence how nations view security today. The Cold War also left behind political transformations across the globe. In Eastern Europe, the fall of communism led to new democracies, market economies, and integration into Western institutions such as the European Union. Yet the transition was not always smooth. Economic hardships, corruption, and political instability followed in many countries, leaving mixed feelings about the promises of the post-Cold War era. In Russia, the end of Soviet rule brought both new freedoms and deep crises, setting the stage for the rise of new leadership and a reassertion of national power in later decades. In the United States, the Cold War shaped foreign and domestic policy in profound ways. Military spending, intelligence networks, and technological innovation became central features of American life. The competition with the Soviet Union accelerated the space race, leading to the Apollo moon landing in 1969, a milestone that remains one of the most celebrated achievements in history. At the same time, the fear of communism deeply influenced American politics and culture, fueling movements like McCarthyism and shaping debates about civil liberties. Even today, echoes of these cultural battles remain in popular imagination. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of the Cold War's legacy is how it shaped the idea of freedom. For millions of people in Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War represented the victory of individual rights over state control, of democracy over dictatorship. For Americans and their allies, it confirmed a long-standing belief in the resilience of free societies. Yet the struggle also revealed the costs of maintaining security. Wars fought in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere demonstrated that the Cold War was never cold for those caught in proxy conflicts. The human cost of these battles remains part of the legacy as well. Economically, the Cold War spurred both innovation and division. The competition between systems pushed the United States and the West to pursue technological advances, from satellites to computers to military hardware that later found civilian applications. At the same time, the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy struggled to keep pace, highlighting the weaknesses of authoritarian models in a globalized world. The economic gap between East and West became one of the decisive factors that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The legacy also includes a transformed world order. With the end of the Soviet Union, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, ushering in a unipolar era. For a time, it appeared that American ideals of democracy and capitalism would spread unchecked. However, new challenges soon arose, from terrorism to rising powers such as China, demonstrating that while the Cold War had ended, history had not stopped. The memory of the Cold War continues to influence global politics today. Tensions between NATO and Russia, debates over nuclear proliferation, and conflicts rooted in Cold War-era rivalries still shape international relations. In many ways, the world is still navigating the consequences of a conflict that defined the second half of the 20th century. On a deeper level, the Cold War legacy reminds us of both the dangers and the resilience of humanity. It was a time of fear, mistrust, and constant risk. Yet it was also a time of incredible achievement. Humanity not only survived the nuclear age, but advanced in science, medicine, and communication in ways that continue to benefit the world. The Cold War demonstrated the destructive potential of division, but also the creative power of competition.
As the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, many believed the world was entering an age of peace. Reality has proven more complex. Yet the symbolic power of that moment, when ordinary people broke down a wall that had stood for decades, endures as a lesson. No matter how strong divisions may appear, human will and desire for freedom can prevail. The Cold War was not simply a struggle between two superpowers. It was a global contest of ideas, a test of human endurance, and a chapter in history that continues to echo today. Its legacy can be seen in the alliances that endure, in the weapons that remain, in the cultures that remember, and in the political systems that emerged from its ashes. As we close this chapter, the Cold War remains both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us of the dangers of unchecked rivalry, of the destructive potential of fear and mistrust. But it also inspires us with the reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can find a way forward. The end of the Cold War was not the end of history, but it was the end of an era that shaped the modern world in ways we still live with today.
Is over, but its lessons continue to echo through history. For nearly 50 years, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a rivalry that shaped the modern world. From nuclear weapons to cultural propaganda, from proxy wars to space exploration, the Cold War was not just about two nations. It was about humanity confronting its own capacity for destruction and its ability to endure in the face of fear. As we look back, the question is not only what happened, but what we can learn from it. One of the most important lessons of the Cold War is the danger of unchecked competition. Both the United States and the Soviet Union believed that their survival depended on outpacing the other in every possible way. This mindset fueled the arms race, leading to tens of thousands of nuclear weapons being built. At the height of the conflict, the world had enough nuclear firepower to destroy itself many times over. The lesson here is clear. When nations allow rivalry to override reason, the consequences can threaten all of humanity. Today, as new tensions emerge around the globe, the memory of the Cold War reminds us of the need for caution, dialogue, and restraint. Another lesson lies in the power of ideology. The Cold War was not only about bombs and tanks, but about ideas. Democracy versus communism, freedom versus control, capitalism versus state planning. These opposing visions of society shaped policies, propaganda, and everyday life. The Cold War teaches us that ideas matter. They can unite or divide, inspire or suppress. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed not because of military defeat, but because its ideology could no longer sustain its people or its economy. This underscores the importance of systems that allow for adaptability, openness, and the will of the people. The Cold War also reminds us of the cost of fear. For decades, children in American schools practiced duck-and-cover drills, while citizens in the Soviet Union were told to remain ever vigilant against Western spies and subversives. Fear became a daily reality, shaping culture and politics. In the United States, fear of communism fueled McCarthyism, blacklists, and suspicion that harmed innocent people. In the Soviet Union, fear of dissent silenced voices and crushed freedoms. The lesson here is that fear, while powerful, can also be corrosive. Societies that give in to fear risk losing the very values they claim to protect. Yet the Cold War was not only a story of fear and rivalry, it also sparked innovation and cooperation in surprising ways. The space race born out of Cold War competition put humans on the moon and accelerated technology that would later transform everyday life. Advances in medicine, computers, and communications were driven in part by the competition between East and West. Later, in the final decades of the Cold War, diplomacy and negotiation showed that even bitter enemies could find common ground. Treaties such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty proved that dialogue could reduce danger. The lesson here is that rivalry can produce progress, but cooperation ultimately secures peace.
Another lasting lesson is the resilience of people. The Cold War was not fought only by leaders or armies, but lived by ordinary citizens across the world. Families in divided Berlin, farmers in Vietnam, soldiers in Korea, and countless others endured hardship because of a conflict they did not choose. Yet people also resisted, adapted, and dreamed of a better future. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was not just the collapse of a symbol of division, but the triumph of human determination. The Cold War teaches us that systems of oppression and division may seem permanent, but they can be overcome by the courage of ordinary people. The Cold War also highlights the importance of understanding history. For decades, mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union was fueled by propaganda, secrecy, and misunderstanding. Each side viewed the other as a monolithic enemy, often without recognizing the complexity of the people behind the politics. Today, the lesson is that history must be studied carefully, with an eye toward truth rather than myth. By learning from the mistakes of the past, societies can avoid repeating them. In a broader sense, the Cold War left a message about humanity's interconnected fate. The existence of nuclear weapons made it clear that the survival of one nation could not be separated from the survival of all. For the first time in history, human beings had the power to end civilization. That power has not disappeared. The lesson is stark. In a world where technology can destroy, cooperation and responsibility are no longer optional. They are necessary for survival. For the United States, the Cold War reaffirmed the importance of balancing power with principle. The nation emerged as the sole superpower, but it also faced the challenge of living up to its ideals of democracy and freedom. For Russia and the nations of Eastern Europe, the Cold War demonstrated both the dangers of authoritarian control and the possibilities of transformation. For the world as a whole, it showed how deeply global politics could affect every aspect of daily life, from education to art to the price of bread. The Cold War also warns us against triumphalism. When the Soviet Union collapsed, some believed history itself had ended, that democracy and capitalism would inevitably spread everywhere. But history did not stop. New rivalries emerged, new powers rose, and new conflicts took shape. The lesson is that peace and progress are never permanent. They must be protected, nurtured, and renewed with every generation. Finally, the Cold War leaves us with a lesson of hope. Despite decades of mistrust, fear, and near catastrophe, the world avoided nuclear war. Leaders stepped back from the brink, negotiators found common ground, and ordinary people pushed for change. Humanity survived an era of unimaginable risk and emerged with new opportunities. This should remind us that even in the darkest times, peace is possible. As we reflect on the Cold War today, we see not only a story of division, but also of resilience, creativity, and transformation. It is a story that warns of danger, but also celebrates survival. Its lessons remain vital for our own time as nations continue to grapple with rivalry, ideology, and the balance between competition and cooperation. The Cold War may have ended, but its spirit lives on in the challenges we face. Its history belongs not only to the past, but to the future, guiding us to remember what is at stake when nations clash and what is possible when humanity chooses a different path.
The Cold War is more than a chapter in history. It is a mirror of human ambition, fear, resilience, and hope. For nearly half a century, the world lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, yet humanity endured. Nations fought, spied, competed, and negotiated. But in the end, the Cold War did not end in destruction. It ended with walls torn down, voices raised for freedom, and a recognition that no system of power lasts forever. The lessons of this era remain urgent. Rivalries can drive progress, but they can also push us to the brink of disaster. Ideologies can inspire great achievements, yet they can also blind us to truth and justice. Fear can unite a people for defense,
but it can also corrode the very freedoms they seek to protect. The Cold War reminds us that strength without wisdom is dangerous, and power without principle is fragile. Yet the Cold War also gave us reasons to hope. It pushed humanity into space, fostered scientific breakthroughs, and proved that even deep divisions can be overcome. The courage of ordinary citizens, the persistence of diplomacy, and the refusal of people to accept permanent division show us that history is not written only by leaders, but by the will of millions. As we look back, we must also look forward. The challenges of today, rivalries between nations, nuclear threats, ideological struggles, and global crises, are different in form but familiar in essence. The Cold War teaches us that survival depends on cooperation as much as competition, on restraint as much as strength, and on vision as much as vigilance. The Cold War is gone, but its shadow remains. It is a reminder of how close humanity came to destruction, and how remarkable it is that we endured. It is a warning of what can happen if fear rules us, but also a testament to what is possible when hope guides us. The Cold War was not the end of history. It was a beginning, a test, and a lesson. And it remains with us, urging us to remember, to reflect, and above all, to choose wisely for the future.